I'm delighted that we have here this morning Dr. Pat Hardy, who is our most recent member of the Council of the Friends of Kenwood. But apart from that, she is a 19th century art historian. She is an exhibition curator and writer. She was curator of paintings, prints and drawings at the Museum of London, and previously she worked at the National Portrait Gallery and the National Museums at Liverpool, and the Horseracing Museum, Newmarket. But now, most importantly, she is the Deputy Chief Curator of the Parliamentary Art Collection. And we're having a lecture this morning that is focusing very particularly on one of my favourite 19th century paintings. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing you, Pat.
I'd like in this talk to look at Ford Madox Brown's The Last of England, produced 1852 to 1855. I'd like to look at it in some detail. It's a well-known, loved and popular painting held by Birmingham City Art Galleries. The artist was associated with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a radical group of mid-19th century artists who sought to challenge established styles of painting and seeing the world. This painting encapsulates Brown's view of the world in vivid detail, and having studied it for a long time, I'd like to offer you a different interpretation from the usual one, a view that looks at what Brown was influenced by in terms of current artistic theory, physiognomic theory, and by the ideologies surrounding emigration of the time. First, something about Brown, Ford Madox Brown. He was born in 1823, and he was 29 when he started to paint this work. He was living in Hampstead. His first wife, Elizabeth, had died from consumption, having had a daughter. And his first wife is actually buried in Highgate Cemetery beside Christina Rossetti. Subsequently, in 1848, Brown had fallen in love with Emma Hill, the daughter of a poor farmer who'd migrated to London in the agricultural depression of the 1830s. She was a frequent model, and they were married in 1853, having had a daughter, Catherine, in 1850. Emma attended a school in Highgate for young ladies in the hope of attaining some formal education and some of the accomplishments expected of a wife in the event of Brown's success. They then had two further sons, in 1855 Oliver and 1856 Arthur. So in 1852, Brown, aged 29, was living with Emma Hill, not yet his wife, with two children and another one imminent, and worried about his career and how to support his family. He'd produced some well-received paintings, historical and literary allegories, such as Chaucer at the court of Edward III, but he hadn't secured a patron and remained financially insecure. His good friend Thomas Woolner, a sculptor, had recently gone to Australia and was sending back reports of how wonderful it was there and how many commissions could be picked up. So it's against this background that Brown set about creating the painting we know as The Last of England, which occupied him for several years as it was so painstakingly painted, all with the willing and very patient assistance of Emma. He spent much longer than his younger contemporaries on his works, and his remarkable diary, written at this time, records his insecurity, depression, and general hardship. So, The Last of England depicts 19th century emigration, and its central figures have usually been described as appearing to be overwhelmed by grief and despair, partly due to a tendency to correlate details of Brown's own life with the interpretation of the painting. This is bolstered by reference to the fact that the central male emigrant figure is modelled on Brown. This is his self-portrait of 1850. And that he was considered to be in financial difficulties and that he'd considered emigrating to India. It's also bolstered by the extensive catalogue entry which Brown wrote about The Last of England, but that was 10 years after it was completed. He wrote it in 1865, and it describes all the characters and storylines. So most 20th and 21st century commentators have taken a view of despair and tragedy in the work. The 1984 Pre-Raphaelite catalogue of the Tate exhibition states that the oval format enfolds and concentrates the image of the middle-class couple, dignified but despairing as they take their last view of England. And the idea of despair has been taken up in the analysis of the painting and developed to include a critique of emigration itself as a process, which acted to relieve Victorian society of unwanted elements. Emigration itself has been viewed as a type of living death, an exit, an involuntary activity, not something that was actively sought. I'd suggest that we perhaps don't appreciate sufficiently the context of the artistic climate in which Brown was working, and that he used various highly technical conventions to depict emotions, which a 19th century audience would have appreciated. And these don't necessarily correlate to despair, grief, and tragedy. So if that's the case, we just need to know a bit about the rules which govern the audience's understanding of the time and how they would appreciate such works. With a Victorian narrative painting, we think of the great visual Dickensian panoramas produced by William Powell Frith, such as Derby Day, and of which we could say The Last of England is another instance. They incorporated various elements: setting, visual emphasis, analogy, pathos, irony, relationship between generalized and depicted response, unity, all of which were manipulated to control time and space in an image to present the requisite dramatic moment. Narrative phases aren't all present in the painting at the same time, so you need an appreciation of expression and gesture to understand not only the visible present narrative, but also the past and the future. So this approach means that the understanding of narrative art, like The Last of England, through readings of expression, gesture, and movement of figures, assumes a great importance. Artists producing this imagery relied on the recognition of stereotypical figures and presupposed some level of physiognomical awareness, as well as markers of dress and attribute, setting and location, to generate these factors. So, if artists wanted to present a legible sequential narrative, they had to adhere to these commonly accepted pictorial conventions to reassure the viewer that the narrative was credible, because if it didn't conform to these conventions, it was considered artificial, and this was considered the worst crime possible. So let's just quickly look at theories relating to physiognomy, which was circulating in the 1850s, and how these theories may have been interpreted by reference to the two central figures in The Last of England. The starting point is Charles Le Brun's 1698 lecture on the expression of the passions. He argued that the study of the passions, represented through features and movements of face, revealed the character of the person, and he published a detailed list of illustrations depicting various countenances, which demonstrated the subtle differences between the tilt of the nose, the size of the forehead, the shape of the mouth, and they could all convey specific aspects of personality. So in this slide, we see top left sorrow, top right hope, bottom left resolution, and bottom right love. Sorrow left is usually called the principal emotion in The Last of England, and it was described by Le Brun as represented by movements which seem to reflect the restlessness of the brain and the depression of the heart. Nostrils drawn down, mouth slightly open, colour of the whole face is leaden. Le Brun says it's a disagreeable languor of the soul. The movements of the passion of hope, top right, are described as internal rather than external, and this passion keeps all the parts of the body suspended between fear and assurance. Bottom left, we have resolution. Bottom right, we have what he calls love simple. Following on from this was the hugely influential Johann Caspar Lavater's essay on the physiognomy for the promotion of the knowledge and the love of mankind, 1775-8. And this was widely disseminated, had more than 800 engravings, including 173 copper engraved plates and 359 text images by and after Thomas Holloway, Fuseli, and others, such as Blake. It was a classic pseudo-scientific work, which is extremely influential in the history of psychiatry and represents Lavater's account of madmen, demons, and terror. Here we see choleric, melancholic, sanguine expressions. So most 19th century artists were influenced by Lavater's theories for instance, painters of narrative scenes. George Elgar Hicks followed Lavater's model in his work, and in his guide to figure painting, he describes, for instance, the eye. A large full eye has always been considered indispensable to beauty, and a small one being characteristic of acuteness, cunning, or selfishness, rather than of nobleness and benevolence. Not an eye, however, which projects beyond or is level with the forehead, but this generally betokens want of intellect. One well-documented publication which drew upon Lebrun and Lavater was Charles Bell's republished Essays on the Anatomy and Philosophy of Expression. And we know that the Pre-Raphaelites read Bell, who stressed the importance of anatomy in expressing character and the relationship between the portrayal of emotion and the physiology of the nervous system. According to Bell, the artist had to dissect in order to understand how structure constitutes form. Mere copying without knowledge of the structure based on scientific analysis was, he said, inaccurate and unnatural. I should say at this stage that works on physiognomy tended to focus on men rather than women, but there was a recognised code for elicited information about female characters, and this focused on regularity of features based on classical ideals of harmony and proportion. It emphasised decorum in behaviour. So, for example, a paroxysm of grief would be viewed as a sign of impropriety. Brown was aware of these theories, as we know in his article on the mechanism of a historical picture, published in The Germ in 1850, so a couple of years before he painted The Last of England. An artist, he wrote, should become thoroughly acquainted with the character of the times and the habits of the people. He should show where possible and use where possible real-life models of friends and family to give greater credence to the portrayal of the characters and familiarise himself with the necessary costume and accessories. And he should give the most prominent places in the composition to the most important actors. Brown continued, how much more beautiful is the picture when the anatomy is displayed, the thinness of a careworn face, the front of the ridge of the frontal bone highly illuminated, the veins in their course over the temple, the delicate transparent colours of the skin. So, what's the relevance to The Last of England? Let's go back. Following the ideas set out in The Germ, Brown gave a prominent place to the two central figures, its male emigrant figure and his wife with a tiny baby tucked up in her dress. Both of them have a steady gaze, and they're shown in the stern or the back of the emigrant ship as it leaves port. The presence of the baby is conveyed by the bulge representing the baby's head in the grey shepherd plaid, raised slightly by the wind to reveal the glossy purple of the dress beneath. By the small hand, and by the scarlet and white knitted sock, which protrudes through a gap in the brown tarpaulin, which covers the wife's knees and links mother and father figures. One major point to note at this stage is the ungloved hand of this male emigrant, which is given a central position, placed in a vertical line directly below the figure's head, clearly indicating its importance as a motif of family unity, linking mother, father, and child. They were painted in such a way as to appear very close to the picture surface, so that each feature could be read carefully by the viewer. So we go on to the associated works, and you'll get a sense of the care that Brown took in the composition. Here we have the compositional drawing, 1852 in pencil. So if you note the V shape of Brown's face, all the essential elements of the composition are fully worked out in this design. The chief amendments would be the addition of the small child modelled after Catherine on the left and a row of cabbages in the foreground. The lifeboat is rather boringly in this design called White Horse Line of Australia, and in the oil it was renamed El Dorado. Next we have Emma Hill, the study, black chalk with wash. This was produced in December 1852, and according to Brown's diary, it was outdoors when the snow was lying on the ground, no sunlight, in the most inhuman of weather. This is an oil sketch, again rather a pinched face of the central figure. Then we have an oil on canvas, 1860. So it's a later replica. It's more brightly coloured. It's held at the Fitzwilliam. And he was asked to paint it because of the success of the original. We have another later watercolour at Tate. This version was painted for George Ray of Birkenhead, who was quite an important sponsor for Brown. And then the engraving of 1870, which was hugely popular. So behind this central family unit, we see a dense grouping of 8 more figures, and I hope you can pick them out. Only 2 of these figures portray visible features. There's the young girl eating the apple, modelled, we think, on Brown's daughter, Catherine, and the figure at the rear shown shaking his fist. The middle group in the composition was described by Brown in his 1865 catalogue as the honest family of the greengrocer kind, a father and 3 children. The father is shown in grey splattered hat with thick fingers, but the main thing you probably can pick out from where you're sitting is a white smoking pipe that extends almost to on the level of the man's rim of his hat. Next to him, and pushed up against the central emigrant man, is the greengrocer's eldest daughter. Shall I point these out to you?
Yes.
So there's the pipe of the father, and this is the little family of the honest greengrocer. So we have a daughter here with her blue rimmed hat. We have the son with his red hair, and then squashed behind with the pipe is the father. So we have the greengrocer's eldest daughter, made visible by her brown straw bonnet, neatly tied with a blue ribbon, red shawl, brown gloved hand, and disturbingly one eye, which gazes out just below the central emigrant man's hat. The eldest daughter has her arm around her brother and is holding his white comforter. Yeah. So she's holding his scarf. Most of this son's body, which parallels the diagonal of the shoulder and arm of the central emigrant man. So this is the son on the left-hand side of the central emigrant man. He's just visible in a brown corduroy suit, blue socks, stout laced boots with iron-capped heels and comforter, and he's kneeling on a bench, shown looking outward to the right of the painting across the sea, and he has his arm around his elder sister, but his face isn't seen. All we see is his chestnut hair tossing in the wind, which is imagined to be blowing in from the right. The small girl on the far bottom left stares out, one hand holding an apple, and the other her brother's white knitted comforter. She has attractive rounded features, but is coatless, her bare arm and hands dyed like an autumn leaf with wintry air, wrote a contemporary critic. The 2 older children are therefore united, with the younger one being pulled along. The father close behind them, but not linked in the same way. We have vertical lines of pipe, blue bonnet ribbon, woolen comforter, boy's back, and youngest daughter's arm, slicing through this group, creating a diagonal rather than a circle, all very much squashed into that space. The trio of emigrants at the rear present unattractive physiognomic features from what can be seen. A reprobate, according to Brown, with gaps in his teeth, smoking a cigar, carrying a bottle in an olive frieze coat and battered hat, is shown shaking his fist at England. His drunken boon companion, dressed in nautical togs, again Brown's description, pushes his face up next to that of the reprobate, while his hands paw at the reprobate's sleeves. The aged mother with flattened bonnet and old shawl reaches up to him. Her face is obscured, and she's portrayed primarily by her large reddened hands. This group is pushed to the rear, but still included in the shipboard society, through the reprobate's fist, punching the inner circle of the honest family, suggested by the arch of the davit, which is the white metal crane which was used to lift the lifeboats up and down, rising above the father's hat and thus linking the two groups. So Brown's cleverly trying to join up these three distinct groups of figures: the reprobate section at the top, the honest family in the middle, and then the central emigrant family foregrounded. Now you might just be able to pick out a final member in the scene, which is a crew member placed in the lifeboat collecting vegetables for dinner. He's the only figure not to be linked in some way. He's outside that white metal arch of the davit, and he's shown engrossed in his own world of seamanship. The prominence of the central characters is accentuated by them being locked away in their own space, set apart from the density of the grouping behind them, but not completely separated from them. Their space is defined by the roped railing around a bulwark which encircles them at the front and right of the painting. This barrier of rope is not a solid wall, but comprises diamonds of crisscrossing netting with spaces between the railings, so the central emigrant couple are not hemmed in or invisible to the viewer. A large black umbrella acts as a barrier on the right side, shielding them to some extent from the sea spray, drops of which can be seen on the top. The circle of their space is partially completed by the arc of the davit, which we've just been talking about, above the central emigrant man's head, by the blue ribbon of the eldest daughter's bonnet, by the corduroy suit of the greengrocer boy, both behind the central figures, and by the curve of the sleeve of the central male emigrant, with the string attaching his hat to his button. So I'm suggesting compositionally a circle for this central group. So, having unpicked the composition to some extent, it's important to establish in the narrative, what these emigrant figures are imagined to be doing. First, where are they going? If the imaginary destination is believed to be Australia, then they're not just emigrating, but they're leaving Britain to found new colonial settlements. As colonists, they would have a different image and perceived character from emigrants, say, to the US or other non-colonial destinations. Emigrants to those destinations were perceived very much as being the flotsam and jetsam of society forced out of Britain. The destination of Australia conforms to Brown's 1865 catalogue entry as "our homes to seek amid Australian fields." This is also the name of El Dorado on the lifeboat, which in 1852 would have signified the gold rush in Australia. The ship was shown at Dover, with the white cliffs in the background rather than Liverpool, which would have meant the United States as a destination. So I think we can be fairly confident that the imagined destination in this work is Australia. Secondly, what are the central figures looking at? Again, there's been a bit of discussion about that. You think back to England, although it's confusing because of the white cliffs in the top right of the painting. The 1865 catalogue says the figures are sitting in the stern where the cabbages are hanging. And the position of the lifeboats, top right, also gives a clue, because usually lifeboats were positioned in the stern, facing in the same direction as the ship's heading. The lifeboat here has the name on the stern of El Dorado, with a trickle of rust on it, and is pointing away from the viewer, namely in the direction the ship's heading. And also, obviously, the title suggests the direction is that of looking at the last of England. On the horizon on the top left, the sun is shown gently breaking out of the grey clouds, suggesting the course on which the ship is heading. And there are two other boats in the rear of the painting, a sailing boat and a steamer, chugging in, suggesting that the ship is pulling out from the bay towards the open seas. The positioning of the lifeboat, the movement of the waves, all suggest this forward motion, as does the positioning of the umbrella and the way in which the wife's ribbons and blue veil are blowing. The churned up foam of the waves, the smoke of the steamer, all indicate that the wind is blowing in from the right, and the natural conclusion is that the wind is blowing the boat forward rather than that the boat is working against the wind by travelling forward from the top left of the painting to the bottom right, with the white cliffs forming a half circle around the right-hand side of the boat. So the destination is imagined to be Australia, and that the figures are looking back to England are important to the narrative and the meaning of the painting. Because in the 1850s, there was a strong drive to populate Australia, preferably with young agricultural workers who travelled in a family group. This drive was fuelled by a government agency called the Colonial Land and Emigration Commission, which provided financial assistance to such emigrants. It was also fuelled by commercial organisations, shipping lines, railway companies, and sponsored by philanthropists. And this is an engraving in the Illustrated London News, the 10th of July, 1852, and it's of the emigrant ship Bournemouth, and it housed 800 emigrants. It shows how crammed they were with single men, single women, married couples, all separated with the couples in the middle. Steerage occupied the decks on or immediately above the waterline, and there was a dormitory with 2-tier bunks lining the space of the deck and the dining table. This is an engraving from 1849 in which an artist travelled with an emigrant ship to Australia to try to disseminate a positive view of the journey to encourage people to emigrate. There were few geographical features on the long journey, which took about 3 months, and here we see the vast expanse of sea. One emigrant on the Abel Gower ship in 1852 wrote that the journey was one of the greatest monotony and very tedious, nothing to be seen on the voyage to release the sameness of the scene. Everything was very hot, everything still, and not the slightest noise but the ripple of the water as we glided silently through it and the creak of the rope in the blocks. For all these newspaper articles and booklets, Australia was presented as a new world, reminiscent of Old England. Australia's image between 1830 and 1850 was being transformed from a convict destination to an Arcadian paradise where all classes might enjoy fresh air, greenness, and a sense of space. Samuel Sidney, a prolific writer of the time, wrote, "The wealthiest offset of the British Crown, a land of promise for the adventurous, a home of peace and independence for the industrious." It was represented as Arcadia, a place of justice, prosperity, harmony, morality, social freedom, contentment, leisure, simplicity, a place where demeaning and inefficient paternalism, working class poverty, and disorder would be prevented. Supporters of emigration advocated Australia as the type of society they imagined England to have been in the past. So this vision of Australia became a substitute for a vanishing England, and the yearning for a time of innocence and contentment on an idealized rural past became focused on looking forward to a rural paradise in the future in the colony, based on a collective memory of England. Now, this was partly driven by the manpower requirements of Australia, which did seek large amounts of agricultural labour. So there was a strong ideological campaign to persuade British workers to go and settle in Australia, and to counter this impression that Australia was just the home of convicts and paupers. And financial assistance was given to satisfy those who had to fulfil a raft of criteria, such as industriousness, domesticity, religion, health. And part of this campaign involved written texts, but also a huge amount of paintings, drawings, and engravings were produced, of which this is one. It's Paul Falconer Poole's The Emigrant's Departure of 1838. So it's quite an early work, and it shows the bustle of departure as the elderly grandparents left behind in the country cottage. Mother is centrally positioned, and there's pathos in the 2 young children embracing. The father is shown near the door, sort of indicating the way ahead. This was again another piece from the Illustrated London News. Lots of music, broadsheets were produced as well, and these songs were sung when the emigrants left England. This is James Collinson, The Emigration Scheme, 1852. It's beautifully painted, very detailed. A cottage in which a letter, presumably from a relative in Australia, has been received, and it sits on the father's knee, while the family listened to a young boy reading out details from the newspaper, which are imagined to be the type of emigration scheme set up by this Colonial and Land Emigration Commission, trying to persuade people to emigrate. The viewer can clearly see what each figure is doing and thinking, and they've got an indication of the difficulties that the family is facing by the presence of this sickly girl on the left, who's fallen asleep with her head against her mother's lap. It's almost like a critical point where the family are deciding whether to go to Australia, and they're very much presented as ideal colonials, with the neatness of the dress and the detailed interior. This is Richard Redgrave, The Emigrant's Last Sight of Home, 1858. It's in Tate. Here we see an emigrant family on a rise above a village, which has been identified as Abinger Bottom, at the junction of the path, which meanders down to the village from which they've come, and then a sandy track which continues upwards. They're part almost of a triangle, with on the right several cottages nestling in the hillside thought to be Leith Hill, and on the left this golden expanse of hill punctuated with tiny figures waving them off. The father figure is similar to that engraving we've just looked at in his stance, but he opens his arms in a very different gesture, almost communing with the land, with his eyes half shut. And it's a vision shared by the small child in the smock standing beside him, which is an indication really that that's the next generation going out into the new world. The family convey characteristics of worthy colonials, industrious, neatly dressed, but the juxtaposition of lines by Oliver Goldsmith's The Traveller with the painting has rather queried just how positive a view this is of emigration. The lines are, "Have we not seen round Britain's peopled shore, her useful sons exchanged for useless ore, forced from their homes a melancholy train, traverse climes beyond the western main." And also the presence of this lame boy walking up the path, and the disconnectedness of the father really to the rest of the family. The two girls have their backs to him, the mother's sitting down. But if the Goldsmith verse is understood to relate to this pervading sense of nostalgia for a lost country way of life in an increasingly urbanized England set within this beautiful countryside, and the father's stance and expression is representative of a vision of a future life in a golden country overseas, then painting and verse do take on an internal consistency and external coherence, which aligns them to other paintings of emigration. Oh, this is a sketch, a watercolour by Robert Hillingford, Emigrants to South Australia, about 1860. And I've included this really to show the similarity of narrative with the Poole painting, which was almost 20 years earlier. And there's this flurry of activity as the family prepare to emigrate to Adelaide in South Australia, which is written on the trunk. Last minute packings taking place, as stray shoes discarded on the floor, the confusion of the final minutes of departure is well captured. The central seated woman exudes a sense of calm, holding the baby, while the two principal sets of characters are joined through linking or outstretched hands. This space is carefully divided into two. So you have a vortex of hands, got a kitten, a bird cage, aprons, white sleeves, white handkerchiefs, white petticoats. There's a swish of cloaks, the raising of aprons, the rustle of ruffled sleeves, all creating this sense of bustle and packing. But on the right-hand side, there's a sense of stillness with the male figures slightly set apart, focused not on this leave-taking, but we have one on the large trunk, checking it's secured properly, and the other two looking out of the doorway to the journey ahead into a sun-filled garden. Here we have Henry Nelson O'Neill's The Parting Cheer, 1861. It's at the Maritime. This is a slightly later work and shows how earlier pictorial conventions were breaking down. All the groups are dominated by strong emotions of grief and distress, shown by the female figures. And the journal, The Athenaeum, was critical of this. It wrote, "No crowd of this extent would be devoid of something nobler than the thick-skinned blubbering and vulgar demonstrations of a low type of humanity. Instead of a smooth storyline, we get tight groupings operating in separate rotations, with the ship itself not giving a clear sign of onward advancement. The painting itself isn't antipathetic to emigration as a phenomenon, but it does show a discontinuous pictorial narrative and a vision which is inconsistent with the previous sentiment to control and confine the representation of emotion in British emigration scenes. Right, let's just take a closer look at these two central figures. The central male emigrant, in what's called a brown wide-awake hat, pulled down over his forehead, and his wavy brown hair is well wrapped up against the cold, and his brown, double-breasted, heavy wool pea coat, and he stares out of the picture with an intense gaze, his expression darkened by an unshaven look, shadows under his eyes and deep furrows between his eyebrows. He has large, light-coloured eyes, high cheekbones, prominent nose, mouth with a full bottom lip and cleft chin, all lightened from the initial oil sketch, in which the V shape of his face is more pronounced. Few contemporary reviews wrote of despair in the features of these figures, unlike, as I mentioned at the start, of more recent commentators. The Brown 1865 catalogue entry explains that the man broods bitterly, whereas the young wife's sorrow is of a less cantankerous sort. The Edinburgh News of 1860 wrote of his look being one of mingled scorn and love. The 1862 review in the Athenaeum wrote that his eyes were enlarged to a fixed stare and his lips bitterly set. Rather than despair, I suggest that the figures were conveying to a greater or lesser degree the emotions we saw illustrated at the beginning of the talk by Lebrun, for most prominently for the man, resolution. Resolution was in the 1860s commentary conveyed, the eyes here represented as full, open and expressive, the eyebrows especially marked and distinct, the nose partaking of the Roman character, and equally firm and determined, the mouth tight and compressed. As far as the central emigrant wife is concerned, she's drawn as not classically beautiful, but attractive and regular features with wide set, heavy-lidded eyes. She doesn't display signs of great grief, not appropriate, according to Elizabeth Eastlake of the time, when the features become agitated and the nose red, she very properly covers them up. Here I'd say it's love, as we saw in the earlier illustration by Lebrun. Her forehead is not lofty, which would have indicated higher intelligence and therefore not sought in a woman, and has an attractive strand of hair blowing across it. Her hair was fashionably draped over her ears with a knot at the back, and the bonnet flared into an elliptical brim, typical of the early 1850s. Her simple fringed shawl of finely checked wool, pinned under her chin, was worn over a plain day dress, and the outfit was completed by short leather gloves worn over one hand. The rosebud mouth was the perfect feminine mouth, small, delicate, with separate character traits being conveyed in separate lips, the top lip being thinner than the bottom, indicating a restrained voluptuousness. In the charcoal sketch we saw earlier, the figure has an open mouth, revealing small, evenly spaced teeth, but in the finished oil, her mouth is closed, another indication of restraint. The rounded chin was also a sign of the desire to love, and Brown does mention in the 1865 catalogue that the circle of her love moves with her. Her chin also jutted out slightly, which was read as an indication of determination. The Saturday Review of the time wrote, "Her face is indeed the chief charm of the picture." Another reviewer, that it was a pure English face and very beautiful, ruddy with the cold, red also with crying, yet clear and rosy with ruddy health. This figure is also shown with an intense gaze, although in a slightly different direction from her husband. While not communicating verbally with him, she's shown as physically connected through the linking of the hands. So these two central figures would be read by a contemporary audience as attractive, young, and united as a family. They convey differences in expression and gaze, ranging from sorrowful to loving, in which the male figure conveys resolution, determination, and fixity of purpose, while the female emigrant, also immersed in thought, seems more flexible and reactive to circumstance and presents a pivotal role between baby and father through the physical linking of hands. And in exploring the characteristics and expressions, the notion of vision becomes increasingly important. What's perceived by the viewer to be seen by these figures, and what the viewer, us, sees when looking at the picture. For the depiction of the clear-sighted vision of the central figures has been key to the readings of despair of these figures. It's been said that their crystal clear gaze, allied with their unhappy thoughts of what's been left behind, has excluded other possibilities of meaning. But if their vision could be read by us as more blurred than previous readings, which we could argue, because the hat of the central emigrant man is shown pulled down over his eyes, covering part of his face. Sea spray may also be presumed to be clouding vision, as may the wind imagined to be blowing in their faces, and the wife may also be seen to be shedding tears. Not only may their vision be imagined to be impaired, but their other senses may be clouded by shock, for they're located in a space which suggests spatial and temporal confusion. And emigrants frequently use the word confusion in their diaries. Abiju Good wrote, "We contrived to get tea, but such confusion I have never seen before. Hooting, shouting, cursing, swearing, crying prevailing on every side." And the consequence of this confusion and feeling of unreality and complete isolation from friends and former life did draw families together. John Wilcox, in his Practical Hints for Emigrants guidebook, wrote, "If a member of a family band, it tends to unite more firmly and link with stronger bonds the sweets and beauty of mutual affection and dependence." So if this imagined couple's vision is understood to be clouded by us by the physical phenomena and by this sense of shock, then the importance of their perceived thoughts is brought to the fore. This focus is bolstered by the fact that fixity of gaze by a 19th century audience meant a higher faculty of veneration and also indicated that character's inner life. These thoughts of the two figures in the context of a mid-19th century emigration could be imagined to be linked to the promotional material which was widely disseminated at the time about this image of the ideal colonial family and the benefits of emigration. If these figures are placed within a Greenfields Arcadia discourse linking old and new world and interpreted in relation to the physiognomical theories mentioned above, they could be deemed to be looking backwards and forwards to a golden vision which works for a past recollection as well as capturing future anticipation. And there are also more positive signifiers which we've discussed: the light on the horizon, the name of El Dorado, the destination of Australia, as well as the context of mid-19th century immigration. In addition, the vision of us, our vision of the viewer, has been referenced in recent commentary to empathise with this despair by the pictorial technique of portraying objects in realistic detail and clarity. It's been said, for the time being, we, the viewer, borrow the clear eyes of the people inside the frame, the poignant detail and completeness and despair. This clear gaze of us is highlighted by the clarity and detail of the paintwork. But again, when we look at this argument, when examined, our vision, which may seem to be far-seeing and clear-sighted in the direction ahead to the horizon, is in fact disrupted by the detail surrounding the central emigrant couple and the jumble of shapes of the crowd and the setting. Each detail is minutely observed, but the composition confuses the eye. None of the figures are seen in their entirety on the side, as hands, eyes, legs, and arms are cut off and pushed to the foreground. Our view, our gaze, after focusing on the emigrant couple and deciphering details like the position of the baby, the direction of the veil, becomes unfocused as we try to disentangle all these sections of the painting. The shapes are finally deciphered, so the respective hands, arms, eyes, faces are related back to the relevant figures. And this detail of intensity of colour, which appears to be collected at random emerges almost subconsciously until our eye disengages all items to compose a comprehensive image. And in so doing, the intricacy of this composition becomes apparent, with clever devices to join all the figures in a circle, supported by the industry of the hands, with the youngest and most vulnerable of the group in the centre, and the reprobate and the companion on the outer rim. The three children of the honest greengrocer are linked by their hands holding each other, and the figure of the reprobate's mother holds on to her son, who's shown grasped by his companions. The painting in of circles can also be seen in other patches of colour, in the cabbages, the red sleeve and the bonnet ribbon of the girl, and the veil, all leading the eye round in a circle, suggesting the wholeness of society and unity, with the microcosm of the family at its core. So as the chronological narrative unfolds, so the viewer's eye, looking backwards and forwards, is caught and held by the central image of the painting, the couple, drawn there by the wife's vivid ribbons flying out from her bonnet. They fly out like pennants, mimicking ship's flags and the waving of handkerchiefs on departure. Not only do the ribbons link the emigrant wife to her husband in a triangle with his face forming the third side, they also frame the wife's bonnet in a circle with the umbrella. The ribbons act to draw the couple together and push them forward in an image of family unity. The brightness of the ribbons is echoed by the youngest daughter, whose face is framed by her red bonnet. All these circles are drawn out by the viewer's eye, but they come to rest eventually on the bright face of the wife. She encapsulates the power and intensity of this work by representing the primacy of the family unit. Well described by an emigrant, Edward Danson, writing to his brother John in 1870, 30 years after he emigrated from Liverpool to Manly, a small town 216 miles from Sydney. Edward Danson wrote, "How I rejoice to hear that your family circle is unbroken. How strange and mysterious are the claims of kindred. Nor time, nor distance, nor absence, nor misunderstanding, nor pride, nor temper, nor wealth, nor any other earthly circumstance can utterly extinguish them. Some men are ashamed to acknowledge their family affection. I shall not attempt to hide mine in the present." Thank you very much.